Good evening and buenas tardes. My name is Damien Chavez. Welcome to episode 3 of the QuetzalCast, a series of monthly interviews with Latinx theater makers. For this month's episode, I am joined by Georgina Escobar, an award-winning playwright born in Ciudad Juarez, raised in Chihuahua and Zacatecas, humbled by SoCal, born in El Paso, married in New Mexico, who left her heart in Manhattan, and who now joins us from El Paso to talk about her work. So without further ado, let's get right into it.
Yo tenía mi cascabel con una cinta morada, yo tenía mi cascabel.
Welcome, Georgina. I hope you're having a fantastic day.
It's beautiful today, and I'm so happy to meet you and be here.
I'm happy to have you on. The first big question is, what are you working on right now? What's taking up your time these days?
Everything. No, I'm kidding. Gosh, that's a great question. I mean, obviously, you know that I'm working at UTEP. That's what brought me here. So I teach script analysis and directing this semester, which takes my beautiful time. I'm also directing a audio play by Asa Merritt, which is about a West Texas boxer. And the lead actor in that is one of our students and one of my students here at UTEP. So it's really great. We're working with this New York-based company to push it forward as part of this series called Contemporary Westerns with Gilded Audio. So I literally just had, that's the rehearsal I was telling you about that started this morning, which is why my voice is a little strained, sorry. And as far as writing, there's a couple pilots one of them that I'm adapting from a play that I have from a full length. And then there's an original pilot that I'm working on. As you might imagine, the pandemic has caused a lot of changes for people and how we work. And one of the main changes for me has been a focus towards TV writing. So while the lockdown has been happening, I've just been trying my best at TV writing and film. So I just finished a screenplay, and yeah, I'm about to do rewrites on one pilot and adaptation on the other.
That's exciting.
Yeah, it is. It's always good. You know, there's that saying that a real artist never stops learning, and it's always good to push our boundaries. And I wanted to really come back to square one and reteach myself the basics of dramatic structure. And so TV writing for sure drills that into you. So it's been good practice.
Really? So for those that don't know you, you describe yourself quite colorfully as born in Ciudad Juarez, raised in Chihuahua and Zacatecas, humbled by SoCal, born in El Paso, married in New Mexico, and left her heart in Manhattan. Beautiful description, by the way.
Thank you. It's very true.
All of these places are radically different environments to work with, you would imagine, right? With likewise varying art scenes. So how do the theatrical communities in these places differ? How does that come through or affect the work?
I think nomad, like an emotional nomad, is always present in most writers. We allow ourselves to travel and to be sort of migrants of different narratives, of different places, and of different characters, right? And so to actually have that be a reality as well, and have this no man's land experience, whereas I've lived in both countries and in both coasts and north and south of the same country as well, has allowed me to just infuse my work with those places, but always with the main question of, I think, my biggest link, which is here in the borderlands of this in-between. So I think my work a lot of the times deals with in-betweens or nowhere lands or neither here nor there, ni de aquí ni de allá. And in those places, because I was always sort of the outsider, I always experienced that nowhere landness of it. So as much as, you know, I lived in Manhattan for 10 years, and as much as I call it my home, I was an outsider to it. And I think that's what comes through in my work. It's that sort of neither here nor there, no real home. And it allows for a lot of exploration of identity and place.
I was going to ask of these places which has had the most impact on you, but it seems that there's like this general, like you mentioned, kind of like nomad land.
Yeah, they all have an impact. I mean, I think it's where I've experienced each one. You know, Zacatecas really shaped me. I was telling you I went to Montwood for a year. And then I left and I went to Zacatecas. And so to come to central Mexico, to colonial Mexico, after being, in El Paso for quite some time, really shaped me, who I am. It was in my formative years. High school, where you're at right now, was in Mexico. And then having to sort of come back to the United States for college. I think each one has been sort of a trial by fire and a forging of my personality and my shifts. New York, obviously, being a place that demands so much out of you, and it did so in my 30s. So I think it was the perfect sort of smoldering of events that made that happen. I wouldn't have been as in love with Manhattan, I think, had I encountered it earlier on. And then now, full circle, now I'm back here. So they all have an impact in a very different way. And of course, they all, in some way or another, have shown up in my works.
For those that don't know, Georgina is a visiting professor at UTEP, very involved with things like Monsters We Create. And very interestingly, for this next question, UTEP's Reunión Revolución Latinx New Works Festival, which was due to happen was it spring before lockdowns hit?
Correct. And then we changed the format to make it a radio show. And it became a radio show as a partnership with QTEP, State of the Arts. And basically the 4 shows that were selected for the original festival were reformatted and repurposed to an audio format. And Kim McKean, who's my colleague, and she's really the head of this project. I was a curator and a writer in it and a director. Turned it into this month-long audio festival where every Saturday in September there was a new play followed by an interview with the playwright. And it was amazing. We actually are looking for ways to continue that because radio has such a wide outreach. It really deletes all sort of aspects of accessibility. We want to include more Spanish. And so it was sort of a happy accident, actually.
And on the note of accessibility, the pandemic has proved it's given a lot of theater artists this chance to reflect on the accessibility of theater. We've all grown accustomed to the formats of pandemic theater. Stream productions, Zoom productions, radio drama, audio drama. Are forms like that here to stay, or are they more just something that's sprung up in this time? And are we going to go back to this accessible nature of theater?
I hope not. I think it was a wake-up call. I think it's come along with other movements, right? The Black Lives Matter movement and also the Dear White American Theater movement. So in a way, it has sort of done this accountability check on our field that has said, hey, you know what, theater is supposed to be accessible. And, a similar thing happened if you think about Shakespeare and the return to the stages right after they were locked down with the Black Plague and everything. Like when they came back, it became more about the people's theater, right? And it left the royal court and became more accessible. So I think we're doing the same thing here, where in shutting down, we realized that, hey, we shouldn't be paying $300 a ticket in New York. Everybody should be able to have access to this. And so I think there's going to be a hybrid, resurfacing. Of course, we're going to have the same theater that we used to have, but I think better and more accessible, and we're going to have other options for outreach.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, this reframing and how theater artists conceive of their art form is not just in the terms of accessibility, but also racially in the wake of a resurgence of the Black Lives Movement. And you mentioned specifically Dear White American Theater. And we have seen some action in regards to that. A lot of theaters have responded specifically to the demands of things like Dear White American Theater and diversified their boards and what artistic directors even look like across the board.
Correct.
Are the changes that we're seeing, you think, sufficient for what the occasion calls for?
I mean, it's a start, right? As we all know, I mean, I've been part of the Latinx Theater Commons since its inception, and that's a 5-year movement that has changed dramatically and continues to evolve and continues to be held accountable and questioned. So having seen that's why it's called a movement, right? And that's why movements are movements and not organizations or production entities. And I think what we're seeing is that theater is a movement. Theater is self, and theater creation is a movement, and not this contained, packaged material that you can sell and that has, checks and balances for patrons, but that is actually continually evolving, continually questioning. And that's the role of it, right? That's why it's so starkly different from the small screen or the big screen. So I think it's obviously not enough, but it's a start, and that's what's exciting. I always said to people when they spoke to me that I never wanted to, when I was in New York, I never wanted to make it in the theater. I wanted to make it anew. So I've always been interested in the construction of what the new American theater looks like, because it needs to include obviously people from the border, people like us, people, BIPOC writers and executive directors and other positions. So I'm excited to see it kind of burn a little bit so that the new grass can start to sprout from it, without taking over or being possessive or, scaring people. It's just a matter of, thinking it over.
You mentioned specifically the Latinx Theater Commons and how that's changed quite a bit over the 5 years since inception. So how has that changed? What is it now, and how is that different from the original vision when it was founded?
The beautiful thing about it is that it's a commons-based movement, which literally means there's no hierarchy. It's a circular hierarchy. We have a producer only because when we were doing convenings, we obviously need somebody behind the hey, here's your Zoom call. So we did need a little bit of a managing arm. So about 2 years in, or a year in, we set out the call to raise funds to always have a producing manager, and that's the only paid position in the Latinx Theater Commons. Everybody else is an absolutely volunteer position, and it's a lot of time, and it's a lot of phone time, email time. It's a lot of volunteer hours that you spend in there. And so the greatest change that I've seen happen to it is that because it's voluntary and it's commons-based approach, it's really about who's energizing the movement at each turn. So there was a time when there was a particular group of people perhaps that were energizing the movement towards the art-making aspect of it. We have 4 tenets: art-making, scholarship, advocacy, and convening. And so there's always been sort of a movement, right? An energizing engine behind these. And I really feel that 5 years in, right now, we're in the advocacy arm. And there's a brilliant group of people that are being the fire for that engine, and that we're all behind. And so that's what I mean about how it's changed. It's more like it's a revolution, right? It's revolutionary in the sense that it turns full circles, but with different people at the helm and addressing different parts of our tenets and our values.
That's interesting. I mentioned a bit ago that you're a professor at UTEP. El Pasoans may very well be acquainted with one of your earlier productions, something that went up a couple of weeks before the lockdown started to hit here on the continental U.S. The Monsters We Create. You describe it as frontera funk, a lot of your writing piece?
Yes.
That was actually done with an advanced playwriting class, correct?
Yes, absolutely. That's actually the reason I came back. I was in New York, like I said, and I was hired basically at UTEP to teach a playwriting class that would function as the generative arm behind a new play production, based on nothing but a title that we kind of figured out. Kim McKean, again, my co-conspirator, and me. And so that's the original trajectory, was that I was brought here to do that, and I led a playwriting class through a 15-week, developing course where we started everything from bottling clouds or idea creation to delineating structure, to finding the outline, to figuring out characters, to crafting scenes and doing rewrites. And then at the end of the semester, I took that draft as the sole playwright and took it through a rehearsal process, through the rigorous process of new play development. and it ended up in a fully produced piece at the end of our, well, not meant to be the end of our season, but ironically the end of our season. And that's what came out as Monsters We Create.
We most often think of writing as a very personal and solitary activity, but this was created in community. So I want to know a little bit more about how specifically Monsters We Create was different in the process of its writing than any other of your plays, like Alevijes, for example, just in the process.
Right. That's a great question. There's one of the biggest sort of lies or illusions that we've been fed from a white supremacy model is this worship of the written word, right? And this idea that it's one person who's writing the world and the law. And listen, I've worked in that way before. I've participated in that format. It's part of our culture, from lawyers to our Bible. It's about the written word, right? But more and more, especially with TV writing, we realized that collective writing or community-based writing is actually more in tune with who we are as people and who we are as artists. I mean, in theater specifically is a collaborative art form. So what happens when we sort of decolonize the writing process and make it less about, one person and sort of create micro hierarchies? So for example, in Monsters, I was still the executive writer. I was still the person behind the computer doing the typing, but everything was sort of put through a democratic process of like, here's a scene, what's wrong with it? Is it working? What can we add? And so it involved an open conversation and a transparency about the writing, which usually only happens once you hit the rehearsal room. So in a way, it was inviting that collaborative spirit from the page instead of bringing it at such a late stage, which is at, production.
So when, you're not creating something writer's room style, how does your personal writing process look like for any other of your plays?
It depends. I like to, even when I did my master's, I did my master's at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and I set out early on to discover a new process per play. So I was like, I want to see what happens if I change the methodology each time I approach the page, so that I didn't lock myself into like, this is how you write it and this is my process, but rather these are my processes, and like have, a cornucopia of choices. I love experimentation and laboratory. So for me, each process is dependent on what the piece demands or what it's asking for. The most common and effective for me is a really tight time capsule or time turnover. I was part of this group called the Brooklyn Generator. I was invited twice to be part of their group, and the Brooklyn Generator functions in this way. They hire, or not hire because it's all voluntary, but they invite 6 writers to take part of their season, and each writer gets 1 month. And in that month, you engage with the ideation of the piece, the exploration of the piece, and the writing of the piece. And so you start with your month, and at the end of that month that you've committed to, you have a reading at the Tank in New York. And so that model proved to be the healthiest for me in cranking out a first draft, because as we know, writing is rewriting. So the first draft is not the end, product. But a lot of times we spend so much time trying to craft that first draft that by the time we're done with it, we're done with it emotionally. So one of my most effective processes, I guess, of all the ones I've explored with is the time capsule of 4 weeks to write a play, and then however long it takes to workshop, develop, create, and rewrite until production. That's dependent on who's on my team and who's around me. But yeah, the 4 week is a very healthy timeline for me. And I'm very, como te digo, like organic and holistic and weird. And so if I'm writing a play, that has a certain element to it, I kind of construct my room to echo it so that I'm really immersed in it. I'm very method in that way. I trained first as an actor, so I think it comes out. I approach my scripts a la method, where, if it's a really dark piece and it has sort of these nihilistic tones to it, I'll likely write it at 3 a.m. when everyone's asleep, so that I really feel that lack of energy in the atmosphere. If it's a lighter piece, I'll write it in the mornings. So that kind of stuff is just elements I play with depending on the piece.
You mentioned starting as an actor and then becoming a writer and how that affects your writing. And I want to hear a little bit about that more, because personally, I began as a director and eventually moved to writing. So when I write specifically with directing, not acting in my mind. So I'd like to hear more about specifically how that acting-based influences the writing process of your plays.
Yes, absolutely. Well, actually, after I left, I was a UTEP. I went to UTEP for undergrad, but I took a year off to go to Stella Adler in New York when I was in my early 20s and study acting. And so a lot of what I'm saying that actually translates to my writing is Adler based. It's Adler, not method. And what Adler really punctuates or really brings out, at least in me, is the what if, right? The imagine if, the imaginary circumstances rather than the given circumstances. So whereas method, it's very like grounded and yes, of course, submerging yourself in those experiences, which I do use. Also, Adler is really about, but what if, or imagine if. And that is definitely very influential in my writing. I think also inherently I write, hopefully, characters that I know people want to play, because as an actor, I remember what it was like to pick up a script and really want to audition for it and really want to get in there. So I used to tell my writing students in Connecticut that, write scripts that actors would kill to play. Write for your favorite actors in mind, just because then you are fueling those characters with very rich and propelling wants and needs and obstacles. And so I think that just inherently comes out in how I write character. And then Adler and the experimental what if comes out in how I write world.
In regards to what you write, you describe a lot of it as a delightful term, by the way, frontera funk, which I love. So what does it mean for something to be frontera funk?
So it's, in the collective and to honor the collective of it all, I'm very influenced by visual arts, by music, by poetry, by all sort of our sibling forms of art making. And like I said, I went to undergrad here, so I'm very influenced and attached to the bands, the underground rock bands of my era, Mars Volta, Sex Marquis, and visual artists like Zeke Peña and Jason Lucero. And if you think about Frontera Funk from the music sense, it has a very distinct syntonization of what it means. So I kind of borrowed that and applied it to what it means textually. And what it means textually for me, again, like I was saying, it's sort of this space of unsettled, I don't know-ness. That is the frontera, right? That only people from here would know what it is. So it's funk, it's sort of like, and it has that term that's sort of like only people from here would groove with it. But people from outside might find it unsettling or unrecognizable, but yet still groove because of the rhythmic tones of it. So it's sort of a musical borrowing from that. I know Zeke uses it in his visual art, which is great. We've all kind of just merged and taken from, what it means to us. I also describe my work sometimes as Southwest fantasias, because they, again, have that element of surreal or sci-fi-ness that defies the magic realism that we traditionally see in Chicano or Chicanx work. It doesn't isolate the magic from the characters, if that makes sense.
The Southwestern Fantasia, the Frontera Funk, is something that, from experience of having watched it, I think definitely comes across in monsters we create. Mm-hmm. Not just in the text, but that's just the design. When I sat down in the black box and saw the pillars that looked like just like the pillars, supporting the highway, the mountains, everything, it's very Southwestern. It's very of the border. I want to circle back and talk a little bit more about Monsters We Create. Because last month I spoke with Alvaro Sarrios, and we spoke briefly about an old short play of his called Blue Bullets, which, in the aftermath of renewed conversations about police brutality, gained unfortunate relevancy again. It was the play he wrote from 10 years ago about events from the 70s, which was, again, unfortunately relevant. And something not dissimilar happened with Monsters We Create. A very important plot point of Monsters We Create are the STAMPs, the sterilization camps.
Right.
And not just a few months after Monsters We Create, allegations came out of the use of forced sterilization in ICE facilities against migrant women. How does information like this recontextualize, if at all, aspects of Monsters We Create?
It's really crazy. It's the prophetic job of the writer, and I said this to my writers when we met for the first time. Our job as playwrights specifically and as writers is to tap into the zeitgeist. And the zeitgeist, the way I define it, and I'm sure it's defined this way elsewhere, but it's really the spirit of the times, right? And to tap into the zeitgeist can be done in two forms, I think, or more than two, but two more traditionally. One of them is to look at it straight on and challenge it straight on, which is what we see a lot of the times with dramas that deal with timely issues, in very realistic ways, with dramas and dramatic arcs that function as a challenge of the times. And another way to address the zeitgeist or the spirit of the times is to imagine worst case scenarios, or alternatively best case scenarios, right? Which is futurity. And that's where the sci-fi and the futurity and all these genres start to appear in how we attack writing. And I'm a genre writer for the most part. I always sort of attack narratives from this angle of what is the worst case scenario. Because to me, addressing it straight on is basically watching the news. It's telling us what we already know in a beautiful way, but it's still telling us what we already know. And to me, breaking it open into a dystopia or a utopia or a sci-fi or a futurity piece allows us to imagine even, the worst or the best. But if we allow ourselves to imagine it, then we get all the more tools to be able to address it and challenge the status quo, in my opinion. And so in talking about a conflict and what could be wrong with this world as we saw it, the instinct that the writers had in the room for some reason early on was something to do with birthrights. There was something about their instinct of wanting, initially it was going to be about, the dialogue with abortion and all this stuff, but initially it was the writers, it wasn't me, just really wanting to talk about reproduction rights, even the men in our room. And so because of my experience writing sci-fi, I was then able to give it a name and say, well, yeah, let's call it a sterilization camp. It's not new. It sounds new, but it's not. I mean, we saw it in Germany. We've seen it in other camps, unfortunately. And sterilization has always been a way that a government tries to control not only population but genocide in a way. And so that's how it came about. It's borrowing from the zeitgeist. It's finding which angle to tackle it from, and then it's taking from history and creating its new format. And that's where stamps came from.
Prophetic in the worst way possible, right? You sit down, you see the play, and it's just like, Jesus Christ, that's horrible, right? But it's a fiction constructed for a play, and like I mentioned, not months later, we actually start hearing stories
and
coming out from these stamps, and it's no longer so much a constructed fiction.
Yes, that happens. Fortunately or unfortunately, a lot with my work. Shortly after the pandemic, people that had seen one of my plays in New York called Then They Forgot About the Rest reached out and they were like, well, how does this one end? Because the pandemic sounded so much like one of my plays that it made people like wonder about this prophetic quality. But it's nothing other than just dealing with futurity and dealing with sci-fi. That's what it's always done. It's been its function and genre in general. So I love it. I keep doing it. I can't write just straight up realism to save I can, but I don't enjoy it for the most part. um, and I was just very glad to sort of not introduce but encourage the writers in the room to play with genre and not fall under the idea that drama needs to be, realized trauma. Like trauma as drama is something that has not been very useful for people of color. How do we move past that into writing futurity stories and things that can actually activate things like Black Lives Matter and other movements that need that level of imagination?
You mentioned this lovely phrase, this wonderful phrase, trauma is drama. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that, and especially with BIPOC?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a lot of writers, a lot of us. I spoke about it early on, like I said, when I started with the LTC, and I was kind of like the outcast, but I think there's a lot of us working in that way. As a matter of fact, I think even Luis Valdez, who is our forefather when it comes to the shoulders we stand on as Latino writers, but has been playing with this idea of like, yes, we can obviously write, again, we can face the zeitgeist head on and write that trauma over and over. But what I started asking myself was, what are we realizing through that? Like, what is the realization through repetition aspect of it? And if we keep telling the stories of the murdered women in Juarez, if we keep telling that story and it's always sad and it's always tragic, are we moving past it? Are not even moving past it to ignore it. That's not what I mean, but moving past it actively as to what can happen and what can we do about it. And there's also this level of like what they call the misery Olympics, right? Where it's like, if we sit in this level of like, oh, well, this happened to me and this happened to me, that's great. And those make good plays to start with, especially as a writer. You have to write those plays. It's sort of a purging. But to me, it's always like, what's the theater of responsibility? What do we need to show? And I think, again, I go back to Shakespeare just because it's Shakespeare, but even you start to see it in his plays too, obviously, when he moves past the religious dogma and goes into the humanist, right? And so I think in a very similar way, our dogma is the trauma. And I think we need to move it into humanistic, but also ultra humanistic spectrums of like, what are we capable of doing? What are we good at? And what makes us connect and what makes us good people, not what makes us bad people.
A lot of the fuel behind the work that we have, something you mentioned with trauma and drama and Mr. Olympics, does seem to be out of a responsibility almost to tell certain stories that maybe aren't as told. Like, for example, you mentioned specifically the story of Las Desaparecidas of Juarez, right? One obviously might feel a responsibility to tell the story that they feel isn't as told. So how do we reconcile, yes, moving on and telling other stories with also telling these stories that one could feel haven't gotten the attention they heard? They go unheard.
Beautiful. I'm so glad you brought this up, because nobody actually really catches that dichotomy, that contradiction. And to be clear, I don't write trauma is trauma, and I don't write about Las Desaparecidas because there's people that do it better. You know what I mean? My strong suit and my strength is in genre writing, and that's what I mean about like theater, like what I write. Because we have, for example, Isaac Gomez, who's a good friend, and he's a fantastic writer, and he has given voice to the voiceless. He works on, giving voice to those who don't have voices, and he's brilliant at it. I'm just not as good. You know what I mean? I don't know how to sit with that and be able to push it forward dramatically. And so I guess in a big way, which is what I tell my writers, is identify where your strong suit is or what you want to write about, right? But in order to have sort of both, we as a professor especially, we need to teach both. And there's a lot of times, especially when I was going to school, where in playwriting it was always about hinging to that trauma and hinging to that sort of level of realism. And I was never really sort of shown the other side. So all I do is offer a sort of balance of like, and you can even see it now on television, right? There's straight drama and then there's genre. And so, they're not the same and they have different functions, but they're both necessary and they're both important. It's just about identifying what makes you the writer in each of those.
Like you mentioned, one can feel a responsibility to tell these stories, like you say, giving voice to the voiceless. As BIPOC writers, do we have a responsibility to tell those stories?
I mean, I think it's inherent. Listen, I think this is a mistake, or not a mistake, but it's sort of a fallacy that has been put upon us of like, this is your responsibility. I think we do it regardless because we are people of color, or, of course, I'm toda blanca, so I assume my own white privilege in a very real way, but I'm still an immigrant and I'm Mexicana. So without the colorism and without the color politics, and really just talking about the immigrant experience, which I can talk about, I think we are what we write no matter what. So whatever I write, I say this to everybody, even if I'm writing like the screwiest comedy that is sci-fi, it's inherently a Mexican story, or it's inherently, a queer Latinx story, because I am. And so we are what we write, right? It's there. And so inherently, if we're writing, we are being responsible to those voices, and we are being responsible to telling those stories because we're writing, because we're doing it. Doesn't mean we have to write about that. It just means we have to have a voice and be part of the fold, and inherently through that, we are fulfilling our responsibility.
You mentioned like the responsibilities as a writer with the voice. Does a director also have the responsibility?
I think, again, it's inherent in what we do. Of course, I have directed these two plays you mentioned, but I've also directed audio dramas like I was telling you about. But like one of my dreams is to direct Urinetown. Like I love Urinetown. And Clue, which might be part of our season at UTEP next season. And a lot of my directorial concepts are infused with the Mexicanidad that I am. So I'm pitching, I don't know if it's going to be picked up, but I'm pitching my director's concept for Clue, instead of it taking place in 1950s New England, taking place in 1950s Mexico City, and sort of infusing it with that aesthetic richness without changing the language or without going into like, copyright infringement or anything like that, just changing the setting. And so sometimes I think as directors, it's about our aesthetic stamp on it. And of course, it's always thrown as a concept. It can always morph depending on your production team. But I do definitely always view, because to me, that's the most honest story I can tell, right? Of course, I've lived in New England and I can tell that story, and that's fun. But wouldn't it be interesting to see the same type of like rich foo-foo like people in Mexico City, which of course we know they were there if you've read Mexican Gothic and other stories. And again, we don't see those stories. So why not like sort of give us a kaleidoscope, because we are that. And so that's how I do it in my directing, is that I try to always, for País de Bicicleta, for example, it's a Cuban story. Nilo Cruz is not Mexican. It was done for a Georgia company where my actors were Puerto Rican and two Cuban. So the real role of the director in maintaining sort of a responsibility is in being true to the casting. I would have never cast those characters with it was in Spanish originally. I would have never cast them with Mexican actors pretending to be Cuban. If I could find the Cuban character, if I could find the Cuban actors, I'm going to cast the Cuban actors, So I think a lot of the responsibility of the director falls in aesthetics and casting.
Definitely. And in casting, as of late, we're seeing more and more conversation to steer away from colorblind casting into identity conscious casting.
Absolutely.
Which definitely plays a big part of this.
Absolutely. A lot of the lies, again, that we are fed is, we're never going to find these people. But until we try, we don't know. And in a place like Atlanta, it's you're going to bump into the Cuban American much more than you are into the Mexican American, right? Would I do País de Bicicleta here in El Paso? Not if I didn't have to. In an educational setting, it's different, right? Because you want your actors to have experience. But if I had a professional theater company here, would I do País de Bicicleta? Absolutely not.
Right. And this kind of gets into territory that I spoke with Alvaro Sarrios. is there a difference in how we approach casting in a scholastic environment versus a professional environment? Because at a professional level, like, you definitely find Cubans, right? You can say, I want Cuban Americans for this Cuban American story.
Right.
But at the scholastic level, you might not have enough Cuban American students if you want to replace the bicicleta. So at that point, do you go forward with that Cuban Americans to still tell the story that students might not have been exposed to, or do you do another story completely? It's an interesting question, dichotomy between the scholastic and the professional world.
Absolutely. And I think we have to continue to make those differentiations to our students and beyond, of saying, hey, right now you are being cast as this Cuban character, even though you're Mexican and Mexican descent. In the professional world, do not expect that pass, And I think it's just a matter of saying, of training our students to have a rich and robust training, but without training them to be colorblind as well, or to go for roles that more and more people are going to be conscious about casting or not casting.
And beyond just casting, how can we imbue these values of identity conscious casting in the realm of education?
I think in education, there's a bunch of things that can happen at an education level from high school to college. One of the big ones that I've always talked about, especially now that I'm at UTEP, because I didn't realize how abundant this was, is the idea of manipulating the text, right? We can't cut scripts. We can't change words. We can't, be creative collage makers of somebody else's words without their inherent permission or without it being common domain. Now, if it's common domain and you want to cut Shakespeare and put it together like a Frankenstein, that is totally right. But I think a lot of it has been training my students specifically on copyright, and not copyright as this like scary, the lawyers are going to come down on you, but as in like, would you do this to your friend? Like, these are living, hopefully they're doing living playwrights work, contemporary playwrights. Would you manipulate somebody else's text? Because inherently by doing that, you are admitting that you haven't done your work as director, as actor, as producer, of doing a deep script analysis and justifying every single line. And so one of the big responsibilities that we have, I think, as educators is to do really robust training on script analysis and new play development, so we can train our students as they move out there to not consider cutting or changing manuscripts that are not their own, to their will. And the second one, again, is casting. And then for directors as well, it's less about expand your wishes on, I guess a lot of it has to do with like our fascination with the classics. We need a balanced level, I think, in education, of saying these are the classics and this is the contemporary. And even then, like a third branch that is, and this is new play, because attacking all three, from the acting point, from the directing point, and from any script analysis point, they're very different. And I think at those three, that triangle is very powerful, and we need to implement it and exercise it in our classrooms as much as possible. And that differentiation, that not one is better than the other. The classics have their purpose, the contemporaries have their purpose, and the new plays have their purpose, and they have different analysis tools, and an actor specifically and a director is going to need those coming out into the real world.
Right. And I love that you mentioned about like integrating more than just the classics, expanding the canon and what you can study in the classroom. But how do you take those steps when so often even the smallest of steps are met with great hostility? You talk about expanding the canon in a theater classroom and in like in a theater environment, and instantly there's 10 think pieces on why you shouldn't cancel Shakespeare or Beethoven, right? So how can you take these steps when just instantly there's hostility and aggression towards that?
Yes, and this is very, very common. And believe me, I'm not one to believe in cancel anything when it comes to the arts. I don't think we should censor the arts in any way, shape, or form, even if they're problematic. I get that there's problematic texts, but then choose not to do them instead of But that's just me as a playwright. I think even the most grossly offensive pieces of text are worth studying. because how else are we going to learn what not to do, and so it's like everything else. But so yes, unfortunately, from administrative levels, which happens at every level, whether it's scholastic academia or beyond in the professional world, you're always going to have this sort of gatekeeper that is saying, but our audiences, or but our money, or but our parents, or whatever, but I think, again, the trick to it is balance. It's like, it's the same way as saying, look, administrator, executive director, patron, parent, how would you feel if all you were fed for throughout high school was, a red meat diet, or, just beans? Like, we need a balanced diet to function healthily in our bodies. And in the same way, we need a balanced diet in our arts education, because otherwise, we're not saying remove one. We're saying let's balance it out. And so for me, I always use the analogy of our diet, right? What diet are we keeping, and what are we, or diet is not the right word, but what nutritional values are we feeding our students as we prepare them to go out into the real world? And if we are only putting the classics, then we are only giving them one protein source, and that can be very harmful.
Right. And it's interesting because from an administrative or economic perspective, you can see why, why someone would want to keep the classics, because that's there's safety in that, right? Your audience will come see that. But I think moving forward, there has to be a lot more trust put into your audiences. And if you tell a story, they will come. And I think one of my favorite examples of that was the El Paso Opera's 2 years ago, Cruzar la Cara de la Luna.
Yes.
I went to that, Abraham Chavez, and that venue was absolutely full. And
yes,
yeah, and when I think of the El Paso Opera, I think of of the classics of those sorts of operas in concerts, Puccini, Rossini, but and they have merit, of course, right? And we talk about this. We're not removing them. That season, it's not like that season didn't have some of the classics, and there was some Leonard Bernstein later on, but I think it was a chance that absolutely showed that no, we can tell more stories, and audiences will come. And I'm very happy that El Paso Opera took that risk, because I think it showed, at least El Paso theaters and the theater community, that if we tell these stories, people will come. We don't have to tell the same canonical stories, right? More so, it tells it to the administrative and economic and people in the economic positions that might have those reservations that are stopping us from taking the plunge.
They're unfounded now. This is the thing, especially here in this community. These claims that we think we know our audiences are unfounded, because, first of all, we don't have enough data, because nobody's actually collected the data. And second, so it's just this like airy, I know it all. And second of all, we really have to take on our like you said, our trust for the audiences, and really educate our audiences, in the sense of saying, you want the new stuff, trust us. Like, we're not going to remove the Mozart, but here's this taste of a new, of a new thing. And Jason Lucero, who was part of the opera at that time, I think he directed that piece. He's a colleague of mine. We did dinner theater together back in the day. And I think what El Paso is seeing right at this moment is that a lot of us who left and got trained in the real world, like in the professional world, New York, LA, are coming back. And we're, which is a big difference from, like, yes, it's homegrown because we're from here, but we did leave and experience it and then came back, and we're starting to see and bring back the data. We're the ones that are sort of bringing back the data, saying, listen, here it is, and it does show up, and people do show up, and this is what it is. And I think that's what it's going to take. It's a lot of like that brain drain kind of coming back.
Yeah.
And of course the young, the youth rising up to the challenge, and also demanding it from their end, and saying, we need this balanced diet. And together, if we meet at that, brain drain returning and the youth coming up, we're going to be able to get that balanced diet back in our society.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate nature of how geographically and culturally isolated we are here in Texas. I mean, we're like 8 hours away from the next like really big city, so we're not really connected to like the Texas scene, right? Maybe the New Mexico scene, but even then, we're just so far away. And you mentioned that brain drain, right? A lot of talent and brilliance that leaves, but thankfully some does come back. And it only takes one or two to start seeing real change.
It's true. And a lot of that, a culturally rich city it is not rich by hiring people from outside. A culturally rich city is rich because it feeds its own community and it sustains its own community. And one of the big changes that we've seen in El Paso, and hopefully we can continue to see, is to have a pride for our own, and not seek sort of this outdoor, like outside gringo to tell us what's better. Like, it's homegrown. That's what makes communities thrive. And at least me, in coming back, I've seen that more present than when I left. When I left, it was still very like, oh, we're going to hire this person from San Antonio because they know what they're doing. And I'm like, pinche San Antonio, like what? It's so different from us. We're closer to Albuquerque than we are to San Antonio as far as culturally. So, it's taken a lot of time, but we're getting there, and it's up to you all, and you're obviously doing it. What did I say to you before we jumped on this call? I was like, I'm so proud. I'm so glad you have your own company. I'm so glad this is happening. This is the start.
This is the start. Yeah. And I hope, like you said, it was a change in a matter of just 10 years from when you left Manhattan and came back. I'm hoping that I'll see the same change, and generations will continue to see that same change until.
That's right. Me too.
The theater community at large has just changed. Our time is running out here, so I have just one more question before we go. Feel free to take your time. This is the same question I ask everyone at the end. Why theater, and why now?
Ugh, right? I say that because I'm like, I know, it's such a hard one. Again, theater to me I'm all about biomimicry. I think the way to human evolution is to take a look around us and see how other non-human things evolve in nature. And instead of trying to find our own way, just mimic it, right? And the theatrical landscape in its sort of communal approach, in its commons-based approach, to me, is the most organic of the arts. I don't think it's organic for people to work in the void. I don't think it's organic for me to paint something and say, look at me. I love it. I think it's beautiful art form, but to me, theater is the one that feels the most connected to nature, the most connected to how we were meant to function as a society, because it takes many to make it happen. So for me, that is why theater. And why now still, many years later, even as I venture into television, theater continues to be the laboratory of reason. It continues to be the place where you can poke and probe at people's imaginations in a way that also gives them a communal experience where they're sitting hopefully soon next to someone, sharing their heartbeat and synchronizing in their experience. And so to me, it kind of feels like the same question is like, why a family dinner on Sundays? It's like, because that is part of who we are. We are a communal-based system, in nature. And the individuality and the individualism brought to us by postmodern and post-postmodern movements have only been a detriment to our advancement as a society. And so theater to me remains that sort of undercurrent of reason of, no, this is how we're meant to function. So that's why.
Georgina, it's been an absolute delight to have you on today. Where can people follow you and keep up to date with your latest?
Thank you. Well, you can always go to my website, georginaescobar.com. I try to keep it updated, and if not, my reps try to put their stuff in there. And you can follow me on Instagram, the Georgina Escobar. Sorry for the pretense. It's just there's other Georginas. Instagram is my more sort of personal. You get a lot of pictures of my cats. And my website is the more professional. So that's where you can follow me.
An absolute delight to have you on today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Damon.
Anoche por la ventana platicando con mi amor, platicando con mi amor. Anoche por la ventana.
Gracias and thank you for tuning in to episode 2 of the QuetzalCast. Links to Georgina's social media will be in the description down below. Also below are links to Teatro Quetzal's social media pages, where you can keep up to date with our latest. We'll see you next month with a new episode of the QuetzalCast dropping on the 30th. Until then, stay safe. Cuídense todos. Good night y buenas noches.
Ay, como resumba y suena, resumba y va resumbando, resumba y va resumbando.